Okay, welcome back, everybody. I'm sorry about the abrupt ending of the last video. I decided it'd be better to handle this since we were going to go into overtime in two shorter segments instead of one long one. So this one truly will be the last and final segment of our World War One lecture series, in which we will be dealing exclusively with the Treaty of Versailles and various other treaties that pretty much not only dictated the end of World War One, shaped the end, but also shaped the future of Europe and the Middle East, and in many ways, um, still dictate the decisions that were made in 1919. Still, in many ways, to a great extent, explain the shape of our world today. Keep in mind. Keep in mind, and we're not going to discuss this in this PowerPoint, but I see so many people standing in that room. 1918 to 1920. The world was in the middle, was celebrating the end of a war, which in itself put almost 40 million human beings in the ground. Okay, we are dealing with a global pandemic that is going to take the lives of an additional 50 to 100 million people, much of them in Europe. Okay, so put that in the background. That's context. Okay, like, wow, not only have we walked out of this human catastrophe that's World War One, the Great War at the time, but we are going through a global pandemic that's going to take almost twice as many people in some of the higher counts that the actual war did. So we know that Germany surrendered. We explained the reasons why last time. And then June 28th, 1919, the table is set. Germany does not have a seat on the table. Germany's on the menu, actually. That's the old phrase. You should listen to that. If you don't have a seat on the table, you're probably on the menu. Germany's on the menu here. It may not be the Kaiser's government, but it's the government. If it takes responsibility, it's the government that has to accept the consequences for Germany's role in the war. And we talked about the Big Four. And Woodrow Wilson's going to Paris with his 14 points. And he is given almost a hero's welcome in France. The French are incredibly grateful for the role of the United States, which is not lost on anyone, played a pivotal role in guaranteeing the success of the Allied side. Woodrow Wilson has his agenda. Much of it is his 14 points, but Britain, France has their agenda, have their agenda too. The Italians, other people, other countries are showing up also with agenda. Versailles is the big poker table where everybody puts their cards on the table and shows what they were really fighting for, what this was really about. And Woodrow Wilson is in for a rude awakening. He is going to be out negotiated by much more talented negotiators. But wait a minute, on the surface it seems that way. On the surface it seems that way, but beneath the surface, it just may be the United States that has the upper hand in all of this, even though it may not seem that way to the naked eye, and it may not appear that way immediately. Give it some time. And I would argue it very much does come to fruition, that suggestion that the U.S. possibly has the upper hand in all of this. We talked about the cost of the war. All that money that's borrowed from American banks, guess what's going to happen? It's going to have to be paid back. The United States was the #1 lender of this war. When British and French industry no longer could produce the weapons of war, the United States did. And that is going to put the United States in a position of advantage once this war is over. And the chips fall on that table. And the cards are shown. So let's first go. Let's address the main uh, antagonist, the main villain here. Although, I would I'll be hesitant to use that term. I would be of that school of thought that there were no actual good guys or bad guys in this. Two teams, both had their interests, and one won. First and foremost, for the Treaty of Versailles to even begin, and for Germany to even begin to think of even signing off at the end of hostilities, and signing off on the end of hostilities and bringing this end to the war, Germany has to accept guilt. That's an incredibly controversial idea, because the history. I mean, it didn't even start in Germany, but that's the condition. Germany, you want the end of hostilities. You don't want us marching in on Berlin. Okay, let's start here. You accept guilt for the entire war, and then we can move on. And Germany, of course, has to accept those conditions. That main one condition before they move on. The German government, which is basically Ebert's government. That's the government that has to accept the conditions of Versailles. First, we're gonna demilitarize Germany. Germany will not be allowed to keep any large artillery, tanks, or aircraft. No air force for Germany. The German army is going to be reduced to a defense force of no more than 100,000 men. The German navy is going to be reduced to 6 cruisers, 2 old battleships, and an assortment of small ships. And submarines will be forbidden. This is how you defang Germany, you demilitarize Germany. Next, reparations. And you have to understand the vicious cycle. Britain and France owe a lot of money to the United States. And once American bankers, and once this war is over, American bankers have forgotten that. They're going to start putting the pressure on Britain and France. Hey, you got to start paying your debts. Well, Britain, and to a much greater extent France, are in no position at the end of the war to start paying off their debts. So who do you think they're going to put pressure on to meet their obligations to American banks? The Allies, mainly France, is going to have the right to occupy the Rhineland for the next 15 years. The Rhineland is a strip of land in western Germany, the border with France, that was not only the most industrialized region of Germany, but also the most coal-rich region of Germany. And it just so happens, in order for Germany's going to have to make monetary reparations to France, and on top of that, its most profitable region, if you will, is going to be occupied by the French and the British. And Germany is supposed to pay the bill. Germany is going to pay the cost for the Allies to be stationed in the Rhineland. The Alsace-Lorraine, this was one of Wilson's 14 points, which was lost to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, will be returned to France. Parts of Germany. This is a big one. The creation of Poland. This was Wilson's idea. It's going to make it to the Treaty of Versailles. And this, now that you know what happened in Russia, and then you know what happened in November all the way to January, 1918, 1919 in Germany, now you know why it is so important for the Allies to establish Poland, the role of Poland. Like I said, Poland did not exist as a nation state for several centuries then. She had been absorbed by the Austrians, by the Germans, and the Russians. Well, now we're going to recreate Poland with access to the sea. Okay, a weird configuration there. So parts of Germany that were occupied by the Polish people are going to be handed over. Now, wait a minute. I want you to think of the size of Germany when she signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty with Russia. And where's Russia at Versailles? Russia's not there. Russia fought from 1914 all the way to 1918, and Russia is not part of this conversation. Why? Because the French, the British, the Americans, the Italians are of the idea that the Russians walked out. They signed a separate peace with the Germans. Therefore, they have no say at Versailles. Therefore, anything that they gave up to the Germans at Brest-Litovsk a year earlier is not going to be given back to the Russians. Okay? They lost that to the Germans. So that's the Germany we're talking about. So we're going to take where the Polish people lived in parts of Germany and used to be part of the Russian Empire. We're going to create the new country of Poland. Poland's existence is as a buffer state. A buffer to what? A buffer to contain the spread of Bolshevism. Let's call it by what it was called at the time. The spread of Bolshevism from Russia into Central Europe and further into Western Europe. That is the role of Poland. Poland is going to be backed up financially. Poland is going to be armed almost immediately before the ink even dries. On the Treaty of Versailles, Poland is being used as a base by the whites during the Russian Civil War. Poland is supporting the whites. This newly created nation state of Poland is supporting the whites during the Russian Civil War. Is being used as a base for the white army during the Russian Civil War. And as the 1920s emerge, is going to, in hostile fashion, in order to grab even more land to the east, invade Ukraine, or the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic. So Poland does not even begin its inception as a modern country in the 20th century as a good neighbor, not at all. They walk out of the Treaty of Versailles before the ink is even dry with aspirations to grab even more land to the east. On top that they were being used, their use as a buffer state and as a base of operations for the White Army. That explains in World War II, it doesn't justify, but why the Soviets would be okay with invading Poland, at least the eastern portion of what Poland was. You have to take history back to, okay, and then where did this animosity begin? It even goes further. Germany is going to lose all of her overseas colonies, and these colonies are going to be divided up. France, England, Japan, and others. We're going to see a map shows you that. Okay? And then here is the big one, folks. Here's the big one. Germany is to pay 132 billion gold marks. That means like we had gold dollars. Marks was the German currency. Marks as pegged to gold at the time. That means whatever the market value of gold was, whatever you could redeem, how much you could redeem in gold using a gold mark, okay? That's because it was more stable. Just like much of the world, how they printed in currency depended on how much gold they had in reserve and what the market value of gold was. So Germany's to pay $132 billion to the Allies as reparations. That was equal to $33 billion US. So that's how much 132 billion gold marks pegged to gold was worth in US dollars. By the way, $33 billion in 1919 dollars, almost half a trillion dollars. That's an incredible amount of money to pay. Okay. And Germany is going to have a difficult time paying it. Okay. And this is going to lead to problems later on. Okay. I know we're rounding up a bit much. Half a trillion, $440 billion is what Germany has to pay, the equivalent of, if that were the debt today. At the time, it was 33 billion. So, here's, if we look at a map of Germany, okay. Now, if we look all the way to the east, Poland green, remember, Germany had taken all of that during the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. Okay. Now that Germany lost it, the Allies decided that they're going to take all of that chunk of what was once, a good piece of Western Russia, okay, areas of Belarus, and the predominantly Polish region of Eastern Germany, where everywhere the Polish people lived, and there's a new Poland. This doesn't even fit the territorial boundaries of Poland that existed centuries earlier. Poland as a nation has danced around the map of Central Europe like all over the place. So Poland is going to be recreated with access to the sea through the city of Danzig, which Danzig was supposed to have this weird administration, and it wasn't Russian and it wasn't Germany. East Prussia, because of the amount of Germans that lived there, is going to continue to be part of Germany, the new Germany that emerges after the war, despite being territorially disconnected from Germany. But that was so that Poland could have access to the sea. As we can see there in the southwest of Germany, the Alsace-Lorraine is going to be given to France, as is the Saar, which is a coal-rich region. But imagine the whole chunk of a good third of Western Germany, that is all the Rhineland. That's all going to be occupied. Okay? And they're going to lose, even though Denmark was not a participant in the war, they're going to lose a piece to Denmark. And Germany, from its peak at the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, okay, is going to be reduced significantly in order to create Poland. And so there you see there on the map, um, to create Poland, and then what was once Posen and West Prussia is going to be formed the Polish state, even though East Prussia is going to be in the hands of Germany. We'll get to the others a little bit, how the Baltics were divided up. And well, here's another map showing us the Rhineland. That's like I said, the western third of Germany. If you imagine a vertical strip. This map shows us where German people lived. Okay, if you see in, well, one day is going to be Czechoslovakia, all that area in red, that's called the Sudetenland. And then to the south, the Austrians are German people also. And then what about Germany's overseas colonies? Togo is going to be split between the British and the French, into French Togo and British-controlled Ghana. See, now it's coming into, what were the French and British really looking to get out of this? And this makes it pretty apparent. It became a land grab. Oh, it's going to get better. German Cameroon is going to be split between North Cameroon and South Cameroon, the French and the British. Deutsch Ostafrika, German East Africa, is going to become Tanzania under British control. Deutsch West Africa, which was German, is going to be handed over as a mandate under the administration of the South African government. Little fun fact, the South Africans are going to govern this mandate that was given to them by the British at Versailles until I believe the early 80s, when the country of Namibia wins independence from South Africa, and in no shorter this had to do with Cuban troops in Angola to the north. The once German enclave of Qingdao is going to be handed back to China, but Japan is going to retain rights over the railway in that region, and that's going to cause some conflict. Yes, that's the former flag, one of the earlier flags of the Republic of China. Papua New Guinea is going to be split between the British under the administration of the Australians. So it seems the British pretty much walked out with with the French, most of Germany's overseas colonies. That's why they didn't care too much for Wilson's 14 points. They had no intention whatsoever of letting go of their colonies. That was one point that Wilson was not able to insert at Versailles. Let's talk about the Austrians. And like I said, Austria's particular difficulties and challenges, it was multinational, multi-ethnic, multicultural, with nationalist sentiments within their borders, ruled by the Austrians, which are a German people from the capital of Vienna, the Habsburgs. But now the war is over, and that ruling dynasty is done. Oh, and just like the German monarchy is done as well. At the Treaty of Saint Germain, this is the first treaty, September 10th, 1919, in which they formalized the dissolution of Austro-Hungary, namely by creating the state of Hungary, the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, and then later on the creation of places like Czechoslovakia, Austria. Italy gets the Tyrol, which is what they fought for, if you see there. The Treaty of Trianon. The Treaty of Trianon is what formalizes the creation, the territorial boundaries Once Austria has already been created by the previous treaty, this is going to set the territorial boundaries of what was once internally the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So what's going to become the landlocked country of Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and what's going to go on to become Yugoslavia. What happens here, and I want you to consider that for a second. Not only was World War One the end of the last traditional monarchies in Europe, it also created the first democratic republics that Central and Eastern Europe had ever seen. Okay, it would seem that other monarchs are either gone or have had to accept constitutional monarchy rule with elected governments. We took the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and split this empire into a number of rump states. Okay, um, the Austrians end up keeping a very small piece of what was this former empire that they used to govern. Um, the Hungarians as well, the Romanians, Czechoslovakia, and what do we end up? A collection of very fragile, weak, democrat and inexperienced democratic republics that nobody had a crystal ball. But when the predators returned to Europe, which was going to be in about a generation, okay, they're not going to have the experience, the long-standing institutions to withstand the changes that are heading their way. But again, this is very unfair. This is very crystal ball-y. If only they knew the future. I mean, that's true at any particular moment in time. But that's what happens to the Austrians. Are they made to pay any money? No, because the Bank of Vienna absolutely collapsed. They had no money whatsoever. The strangest reparations that did have is the Bulgarians. Remember, the Bulgarians ended up joining the Central Powers because they were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. They did not have to pay any money to the Yugoslav states. They had to end up paying reparations in livestock and coal. So that's a strange one. The Bulgarians that were minor players and all that end up paying um, the the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosnians thousands of head of livestock and 50,000 tons of coal in reparations. All right, so let's get to the interesting part. Remember I said that much of our world today is shaped by the decisions that were made at the end of World War One. Well, let's look at the Middle East in 1914. The Ottoman Empire, and already had been reduced. That's what was left of it. Okay, you had Persia that nominally was independent, but under great influence of the Russians to the north and the British government to the south. And that's always been that thing there. But the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans were Turks, by the way. I mean, this was the size of their empire. It consisted of what's today's Turkey, the Levant, the Gulf states, and that whole eastern coast of what is today Saudi Arabia. And if you're like, oh, how come nobody lived in those white parts in the middle? Because, they're unlivable either. That's deep desert. And that southern coast was very much under British influence as well. And we know that during the war, the British opened up several fronts against the Ottomans. So what happens to this part of the world? And it starts to take shape before the war even ends. After T.E. Lawrence has already put together an Arab army and the Arab revolt happened and that front against the Turks is well underway with promises. Here's the thing, like T.E. Lawrence goes there with King Faisal and hey, you promised us that if we come into this war on the side of the British, we were going to get independence. We were going to become independent states with parliaments and et cetera, et cetera. And maybe T.E. Lawrence made that promise, but the fact is that the British government had no intention. This explains much of our world today. I mean, whether you agree with me or not, much of the anger towards the West that comes out of, in particular, the Middle East, in particular, the Arab world, is rooted in history. That, I mean, there's just not mince words. They were used and tossed to the side. They were used and betrayed by the Allies. Okay? The Allies, whether they actually made these promises explicitly or not, had no intention of giving these people any sort of independence. In May 16th, and this was a secret ingredient, a secret agreement. Sykes, British diplomat, Picot, French diplomat, actually sat down before the war was even over to basically articulate the Allies' vision for the future of the Middle East. Again, another land grab. They drew a line right down the middle, and they said everything to the north is going to be the French sphere of influence. Okay? That's going to be the future states of Syria and Lebanon, and even chunks of southern Turkey. And everything to the south is going to be under British influence. Okay? Sure, we'll set up puppet states, but they're going to be under British influence. And those are the future states of Iraq and Kuwait and Jordan. And, well, let's focus on that yellow part there because that's going to be an interesting one. British Palestine. And that goes back to a term that the Romans used for the Levant. And this is a better map of, what eventually comes out of Sykes-Picot. Everything you see gray there becomes, they didn't want to use the word colonies anymore. Colony already had a negative connotation, so they called it UN mandates. Syria and Lebanon would be either directly controlled by the French or an Arab state under French protection. Okay, so Lebanon would be completely governed by the French, whereas Syria would be a French protectorate. They use the word mandate. The British would take that entire strip there, which they called Transjordan at one time, out of which would come Jordan and Iraq and Kuwait, and that was under independent but a British mandate. Good chunks of what today is Iraq and Kuwait were under complete British rule, and they don't even know the petroleum's there yet. That's the best part. And then the one that's going to cause the most trouble, the British Palestine, which at first the suggestion was it would be under French, British, and Russian protection, but eventually it just becomes a British mandate. So can we make the argument the British and the French looked at the Middle East and said, oh, an opportunity to grab even more land from the locals and get our hands on those resources. And the locals were the Arabs that fought for the British. I mean, that's not the only betrayal. The Indians fought on behalf of the British expecting to get independence, and they got no such thing. They got no such thing. Let's go further down the rabbit hole. Okay. What is to be the future of British Palestine? And already since the late 19th century, there had been a growing movement. You understand, Europe anti-Semitism was a long, unfortunate phenomenon. And we're not going to go into that discussion here in this PowerPoint, how it stems to the Middle Ages and blah, blah, blah. And you should at least know the Jewish people's historical claims as they originated in the Levant. They were expelled from there by the Romans. They spent 2,000 years migrating and eventually settling in parts of Eastern Europe, some as far away as Spain and North Africa. And here we are at the beginning of the 20th century, and the Jewish people, it's the Ashkenazim that live in Eastern Europe, or the Sephardim that live in North Africa and the Middle East, claim British Palestine as the ancient homeland of the Jewish people. And as a response to anti-Semitism, have already began to vocalize in a highly nationalist organization that came about referring to themselves as Zionist, a willingness to reestablish the biblical homeland of the Jewish people and for the Jewish people to return to this biblical homeland. Problem, there's already people there. What am I showing you here? I'm showing what was called the Balfour Declaration. And this is important when we're talking about what ultimately became the British intent for um, the mandate of British Palestine, and to what extent did prominent Zionists, what role did they play in shaping the British decision? Um, Alfred Balfour was the British Foreign Secretary at the time. That's the equivalent of the Secretary of State under the Lloyd George government. Walter Rothschild, uh, from an illustrious banking family, a politician himself at one point, and friend of one of the fathers of the Zionist movement, Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann asked Rothschild to talk to Balfour about greenlighting a future Jewish homeland in British Palestine. And this was Balfour's response: Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political statutes enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And there was other places in the world that were being proposed. But this is important because now the Zionist movement has a promissory note by the British government. There's an intent, there's a will to reestablish physically the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people in the Levant, in what is at the moment British Palestine. Other than a statement that's in this declaration, what is to be the fate of the individuals, the population that already lives there that is not Jewish? Well, that remains for history to determine. And very much, our world today, and particularly the Middle East, is impacted by this decision that was made in 1917. By 1920, if we look specifically at the chunk that the British claimed for themselves as the British Mandate for Palestine, in order to appease Faisal, okay, they created the Emirate of Transjordan, which would one day become Jordan. So they took the British Mandate for Palestine and they split it in two in 1922 between the Emirate of Transjordan and what would be more specifically referred to as British Palestine. And in this British Palestine would be this, would exist the Balfour, this promise of one day, but of realize this this is not really going to pick up steam. Yeah, it was existed on paper. There really wasn't very much interest. I think at one, perhaps maybe 10% of the population was Jewish. It's not really going to pick up steam until after World War II. The exodus, if you will, of Jews from Europe to Palestine, and eventually in 1947 the independence of Israel. And we're going to talk about that in a much later. But why am I showing you this? That's an A level. The consequences of the decisions that were made at the end of World War I and how they still affect our world today. So what's going to happen to Turkey? The vultures are going to descend on Turkey. Just like they did in the Middle East, they're going to try it with the Turks. Okay? The Greeks came into the war on the side of the Allies with the hopes of there's a long and ancient rivalry between the Greeks and the Turks ever since the Turks took Constantinople and renamed it Istanbul. So the Greeks were, well, on top of the fact you already had Greek royalty married into the House of Windsor, um, the Greeks going to jump at the opportunity with Allied assistance to take land from the Turks. So this multi-front war against the Turks turns into, what are we going to do with the Ottoman Empire? We're going to try to dismantle it as much as possible. So the Greeks are going to be promised that chunk around Smyrna. The Italians, you see the Italians there, the French there, Um, the British, the Armenians are being given a big chunk of what was Eastern Ottoman Empire in its border with the Russians. And the Sultanate, the former the Turkish government, actually sides with the Allies. On August 10th, 1920, the Treaty of Sevres partitions the core of the Ottoman Empire and tries to do to it what it did to the Middle East. Problem is, Ataturk. Ataturk was one of the most talented commanders during World War I, and he's able to coalesce and organize opposition within Turkey against the partitioning of Turkey. Okay, the partitioning of Turkey by the various allies. Thus begins the Turkish War of Independence. And for 4 years, Ataturk, jumping right out of a World War One, Ataturk leads a nationalist movement, a armed struggle of Turkish veterans, okay, to push out the Greeks and the French and the Armenians. Yes, the Armenian genocide continues even to Ataturk's leadership. And by 1923, the nationalist, more modern Turks were able to recapture everything that the Allies tried to take for themselves at the end of World War One, and that is the establishment of the modern Republic of Turkey. Okay, and the Greeks were pushed out, and the French were pushed out, and the Italians were pushed out, and the Armenians were pushed back to the border, and modern Turkey was born in 1923. And that's a very interesting story in itself. So you got a big world history. Um, and this is the end result. This is what the Middle East looks like. This is what the Middle East looks like. Is the Middle East map today is a result of World War One. Here's another one. Those borders, those lines that you see, this is something you need to keep into consideration. Just like Africa, we're not drawn by Arabs. We're not drawn by Arabs. These were drawn by outsiders. These were drawn by Europeans. Okay? In the case of Iraq, it worked out beautifully. You got Sunni, you got Shia, you got Kurds to the north. Everybody naturally and traditionally already has an issue with each other. Put them under one set of borders. They're too busy to fight each other rather than the British. Jordan was a bone that we took to Faisal, when the British eventually are going to support the House of Saud and the establishment of Saudi Arabia. So that's as far as the Middle East and after World War One. That's what we need to know, and it goes back to the Sykes-Picot Treaty, the outrageous, what many Arabs consider the outrageous act of Europeans sitting down and them determining the map and therefore the future of the Middle East. And one last map, if we look back, that's pretty much what Europe looks like at the end of World War One. It goes all the way into the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire dismantled. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is dismantled. The German Empire is greatly reduced. New countries come into existence. And if you look at this map, doesn't it look not perfect, not 100%, but doesn't it look really, really similar to today's map? Absolutely. And so we're bringing it to the conclusion here. Long-term consequences, ramifications. Um, that's a picture of. I'm going to give you a clue. Some Austrian soldiers, of which there were millions. Um, in that picture with the mustache is a 19-year-old corporal. Okay, I'm going to ruin it for everybody because I'm not going to do the Dora thing and ask you a question and expect you to answer. His name is Adolf, and he's going to serve on the Western Front. Later on in his memoirs, he's going to describe it as one of the most joyous points in his life. But it's not important that he's Adolf per se, because like that Adolf, there were millions of Adolfs that go back to a broken country, whether it's Austria or Germany. Millions of Adolfs that go back to a broken country not only having to swallow the very bitter pill of defeat, but a country that is completely broken and dysfunctional. There are no jobs. There is no opportunity. There is no future. Add to that the incredibly impossible demands put on Germany at the end of this war. And it doesn't look like there's ever going to be a future, a way out of this hole. Environments such as those breed resentment, breed anger, breed frustration. And one should not be surprised if people drift to extremes, political extremes. And just like there were political extremes on the left, okay, that started to emerge and vocalize and take steps to grab power at the end of the war, there were political extremes at the right who really start to emerge when it becomes crystal clear what a disastrous situation post-war Germany and Austria find themselves in. The Weimar Republic.
Feed Tiger dinner.
Sorry about Alexa there. And so let me just give you a little spoiler alert into the direction we're heading in. That's a picture we need to talk about because then it starts to circulate. And the Kaiser was responsible for much of this, and the generals were responsible for this myth, okay? That Germany never lost this war. Germany was never defeated. Germany stood by the ready at the trenches, ready to advance. So why didn't she? Germany was never defeated. No French or British or American boot ever stepped foot on German soil. So Germany was never defeated. She just didn't win, but she was never defeated. And if she didn't win, it was not because of her soldiers. Her soldiers stood ready to keep fighting and dying. She did not win. She did not pursue victory because she was betrayed from within or from behind. And now we tap into the traditional scapegoat, the traditional boogeyman that existed throughout Eastern and Central Europe since the Middle Ages. And who do you think they're going to blame for being stabbed in the back from within? Well, the Jews, German Jews. Those are the ones that did it. They start connecting the dots. Much of the political opposition to the Kaiser's government, particularly towards the end of the war, when we look at people like Leibniz and Rosa Luxemburg, that's what they were. They were Jews. Something starts to take shape. Okay? We were betrayed by the Jews, and oh look at the people that were the most vocal opponent of the Kaiser. It was the Jews. It doesn't stop there. They're looking at the Bolshevik government in Soviet Russia, of which 80% of the leadership was Jewish, by the way. And the beginning, here's a very interesting fact. A lot of people don't know this. In the history of anti-communist thought, when at the time it was called Bolshevism, anti-Semitism and anti-communism used to walk hand in hand. Okay? To be anti-communist was to be anti-Semite, and to be anti-Semite was to be anti-communist. Not only because most of the leaderships of the Bolshevik government was Jewish, not only because many of the leaders of the political opposition to the Kaiser were Jewish, but let's go all the way back to the root. Karl Marx himself was Jewish. And so you get this myth that somehow Bolshevism was part of this grand Jewish conspiracy to undermine the Jewish nation and Western civilization by extension. And many of these young men, they go back to a broken Germany and a broken Austria, grasping for straws, for answers. What happened? We were so close. Why did it all fall apart? Start to buy into this stab in the back myth. That it was the Jew within, the eternal foreigner, the one that is never quite like us. They were ultimately the ones that betrayed the German cause and the German war effort. A, Germany never really lost, but B, Germany didn't win because of them. And some are going to take these feelings, these ideas, these answers, these conspiracy theories. Because reaction, I'm not going to say conservatives, reactionaries, people that react, tend to very much delve into conspiracy theory. And this conspiracy theory is going to lead to very dangerous places. So I'm going to end this PowerPoint with a picture of a cute baby with blue eyes. Okay? And whenever you see a baby, you really have to ask yourself, hey, it's a cute baby, but should I, don't be so quick to, to lavish praise on this baby. This baby just may be a younger version of that 19-year-old corporal named Adolf, full name Adolf Hitler, who went back to Austria, couldn't find a job, couldn't find opportunities, fell into a very conservative, right-wing, reactionary crowd that was quick to blame the Jews for Germany's loss in World War One, and I think you all know the consequences of that. And that is the end, final segment of our World War One lecture series.